Hi, my name is Oana Gavriș. I'm 24 years old and I graduated with a master's in legal psychology from the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. I've worked as a research assistant on a project investigating the influence of labour parental migration on children left behind, and I currently work as a psychologist within a penitentiary in Romania. I've been a member of the Riddle Lab since 2021. So I think I've always been very interested in finding out how people work, what makes them tick, which is why I chose to study and work within the field of psychology. And I think what better way to contribute to this understanding than by creating knowledge through research. As the title might suggest, it's both factors pertaining to the stalking situation and factors pertaining to the observer of the situation that is not directly involved in it. So it's about, this particular study is about the previous relationship between the perpetrator and the victim of the stalking situation, the intrusiveness of the stalking acts, and on the side of the observer, the extent to which they endorse traditional gender roles and their anxious and avoidant attachment in romantic relationships. So the main findings are that we've replicated previous findings with concern to the contextual factors that influence perceptions of stalking. As shown before, people were more likely to excuse this kind of behavior when the victim and the offender were previously in a relationship. We also found that people were less likely to attribute responsibility to the perpetrator in this kind of relationship context. What we found was that the intrusiveness of it also influenced how likely people were to perceive it as stalking, with high intrusiveness behaviors being more readily recognized as such. What was interesting and what we didn't necessarily expect was that victim blaming or the responsibility attributed to the victim of the stalking did not vary across these conditions. The responsibility of the perpetrator did. So the kind of main takeaway from this is that the more a situation departs from a stereotypical scenario of stalking, which depicts a stranger exhibiting high intrusiveness behaviors, the less likely people are to recognize it as an instance of stalking. And we could also assume that they are less likely to act to seek intervention and support. And then when it comes to the interindividual differences, we, to the extent of our knowledge, we were the first to look at traditional gender role endorsement and attachment style. We had hypothesized that these would play a role, didn't necessarily assume the direction in which they would play a role. What we found was that the higher degree of traditional gender role endorsement, the more likely people were to excuse stalking and to attribute less responsibility to the perpetrator and more responsibility to the victim. When it comes to attachment style, previous research has linked anxious attachment style to the perpetration of different intimate partner violence offences. And we had kind of expected that this would be the case as well, but surprisingly we found that avoidant attachment played the role in perceptions of stalking, with people that had a higher degree of avoidant attachment being more readily able to recognize stalking and attribute blame to the perpetrator. Anxious attachment played no role in perceptions of stalking in our study, at least. I think it's very important to study this kind of thing and figure out what the public's perception of stalking is, because it is linked to how a victim in this kind of situation perceives it and whether they are able to recognize it as a potentially dangerous situation, because stalking is an indicator or a predictor of escalation into violence, and to be able to reach out for help, right? Because sometimes, like I said, it's difficult to tell where the line is. But research suggests that if you've got more than 5 intrusions or a time span of more than 2 weeks, you're already in a situation of stalking that is likely to go on. So for a victim in this kind of context, it might be difficult to tell what is and isn't appropriate courtship behavior, especially within the context of a former romantic relationship. So it impacts their ability to recognize it and signal it. It impacts social workers' support of the victim in this kind of situation. It impacts the authorities' response to it and whether they intervene. And ultimately, or like in the most dramatic sense, it can also influence the perception of a judge trying to determine whether this is a criminal offence.